Rain clouds gathered above downtown Chicago, turning the glass towers silver beneath the fading afternoon light. Television vans crowded the streets outside the federal courthouse. Reporters hurried across wet sidewalks while protesters and police supporters claimed opposite corners of the plaza. Everyone believed they understood the story unfolding inside. Almost everyone was wrong. Emily Carter sat quietly in the front row of the packed courtroom. At 34, she looked more like a schoolteacher than a rising member of Congress. Her navy suit was simple, her hair was pulled neatly back. She carried no signs and sought no attention. Most people glanced at her once and immediately looked away. That was exactly how she wanted it. Across the room stood Lieutenant Jack Morrison, a decorated police officer with a reputation larger than life. At 43, he filled every space he entered. His broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his dress uniform. Medals gleamed beneath courtroom lights. Fellow officers treated him like a hero. Local politicians feared him. Television commentators praised him. Jack enjoyed every second of it. The hearing concerned a controversial reform bill inspired by the death of a young man named Daniel Carter. 3 years earlier, Daniel had died while in police custody. The official investigation ruled the death a suicide. Questions remained unanswered. Security cameras failed during critical hours. Witness statements conflicted. Evidence disappeared. Yet the case closed quickly, and the city moved on. Emily never moved on. Daniel had been her younger brother. The loss shattered her family. Their mother withdrew into grief. Their father suffered a heart attack less than a year later. Friends encouraged Emily to accept the official explanation and rebuild her life. Instead, she dedicated herself to discovering the truth. She studied law at night. She volunteered in community organizations. She learned every detail of police procedure and civil rights investigations. Quietly, patiently, she transformed grief into purpose. What nobody in the courtroom knew was that Emily had spent the last 3 years preparing for this exact moment. She trained before sunrise every morning with a retired Army instructor outside Chicago. Discipline replaced despair. Focus replaced anger. She never discussed it publicly. She preferred people to underestimate her. Jack Morrison certainly did. From his seat near the witness stand, he watched activists carrying folders and protest signs. In his mind, they were all the same: emotional, naive, dangerous to the order he believed he protected. When he noticed Emily organizing documents at a nearby table, he barely registered her presence. During a recess, reporters surrounded Jack in the marble lobby. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded near his face. "This reform bill is driven by feelings, not facts," he declared confidently. "People who have never worked a dangerous street corner want to tell officers how to survive one." Several supporters applauded. Emily remained silent nearby. Jack continued speaking. His confidence grew with every question. "The Daniel Carter case has become a symbol for activists," he said. "But symbols aren't evidence. Sometimes families refuse to accept painful truths." The words struck Emily harder than she expected. She lowered her eyes briefly, hiding the storm behind them. A veteran reporter noticed her reaction. "Congresswoman Carter," the reporter asked cautiously, "would you like to respond?" The crowd turned. For the first time that day, Jack looked directly at the quiet woman across the lobby. Emily slowly gathered her documents and met his gaze. "Not yet," she answered calmly. "There will be plenty of time for facts." Something in her voice caused the room to fall silent. Jack laughed and returned to the cameras. He believed the exchange was over. Emily knew it had only begun, because hidden inside her briefcase was a newly recovered piece of evidence connected to Daniel's final hours. Evidence that had never appeared in any official report. Evidence capable of destroying powerful careers. And the name appearing most often in those documents was Jack Morrison. The next morning, Chicago woke beneath low clouds and steady rain. News coverage of the reform hearing dominated every channel. Commentators debated police accountability. Editorial writers predicted political battles ahead. Most stories focused on Lieutenant Jack Morrison and his forceful testimony. Very few mentioned Emily Carter. That suited her perfectly. Inside her congressional office, overlooking the river, Emily sat alone reviewing a collection of files spread across her desk. The recovered evidence had arrived anonymously 3 weeks earlier. A plain envelope. No return address, no explanation. Inside were maintenance logs, radio transcripts, and a flash drive containing partially deleted security records. The material raised disturbing questions. Official reports claimed camera systems failed during Daniel Carter's detention. Yet maintenance records showed the equipment had passed inspection only hours beforehand. Radio communications referenced orders that never appeared in official paperwork. Most troubling of all, a short audio fragment captured an argument between Daniel and an unidentified officer. The voice wasn't clear. The threat was. Emily had listened to the recording more than 100 times. Across town, Jack Morrison enjoyed a very different morning. He sat inside a private dining room at an upscale restaurant surrounded by union representatives, retired officers, and political allies. The mood was celebratory. "You owned that hearing," one supporter said. Jack smiled. "People want confidence," he replied, "not apologies." The room erupted with agreement. For years, Jack had built influence through a combination of results, loyalty, and intimidation. Younger officers admired him. Supervisors depended on him. City leaders tolerated him because he delivered outcomes. Whenever criticism emerged, he crushed it with overwhelming force. That strategy had always worked, until Emily Carter. Union attorney Richard Barnes entered the room carrying fresh media reports. His expression was less cheerful than everyone else's. "There's something you should see," he said. Jack accepted the folder. Several pages documented Emily's background in greater detail than he had previously reviewed. Law degree, civil rights litigation, congressional oversight committees, federal partnerships, international policy conferences. Jack frowned. "Why am I reading this now?" "Because she isn't just another activist," Barnes answered carefully. "She's connected, extremely connected." Jack tossed the folder onto the table. "Everybody's connected. Not like this." The attorney lowered his voice. "And there's another issue. Federal investigators requested archived documents related to Daniel Carter's detention." For the first time all morning, Jack stopped smiling. The room grew quiet. "Why?" he asked. "Officially, they're conducting a procedural review." Jack stared through the restaurant window at rain streaking down the glass. Procedural review. The phrase sounded harmless. He knew better. Back at her office, Emily met with Michael Reynolds, a respected civil rights attorney who had spent decades challenging government misconduct. Gray-haired and methodical, he approached every case like a chess match. He studied the newly recovered evidence in silence. Finally, he looked up. "If this material is authentic, somebody inside the department is talking." Emily nodded. "That's my conclusion too." "Which means someone is scared." Neither spoke for several moments. Fear changed everything. Corrupt systems survived because participants remained silent. The moment one person decided to speak, the structure began to crack. Michael leaned forward. "Emily, if we move forward, this becomes bigger than Daniel's case. I know. People will come after you, politically, personally, professionally." Emily looked toward a framed photograph sitting near her desk. Daniel smiled back from a summer barbecue years earlier. Young, happy, alive. "They already did," she said quietly. That evening, as darkness settled over Chicago, a black sedan parked across from Emily's apartment building. The driver remained inside for nearly 2 hours. No lights, no movement, just observation. A neighbor eventually noticed the vehicle and called local police. By the time officers arrived, the sedan was gone. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Washington, a senior FBI analyst opened a digital archive connected to Daniel Carter's case. She expected a routine review. Instead, she discovered several missing files had recently reappeared within federal databases. Files that should not have existed, files containing references to internal corruption investigations. Files connected directly to Lieutenant Jack Morrison. As the analyst continued reading, her expression slowly changed. Within 30 minutes, she placed a call marked urgent priority, and before midnight, a federal task force officially reopened Daniel Carter's death investigation. Federal investigations move slowly until they don't. 3 weeks after reopening Daniel Carter's case, agents quietly arrived in Chicago carrying sealed warrants and strict instructions. No press releases, no public statements, no warnings. Emily Carter learned about the operation only because Michael Reynolds received a brief call from Washington. "They're moving faster than expected," he told her. Emily sat in her office, staring at the city skyline beyond rain-speckled windows. What changed? Michael hesitated. Someone started cooperating. The answer sent a chill through her. Every corruption case depended on silence. Once that silence broke, fear spread rapidly. People who once protected each other suddenly focused on protecting themselves. Across the city, Jack Morrison felt that fear for the first time. He was reviewing reports inside his office when his phone buzzed. The message came from a longtime associate. "Call me immediately," Jack dialed. The voice on the other end sounded panicked. "Federal agents interviewed 3 officers this morning." Jack leaned back slowly. "About what?" "Daniel Carter, financial records, internal investigations, everything." Silence filled the line. Jack ended the call without another word. For years he had convinced himself the danger was gone. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses moved away. Files vanished. The system protected its own. Now old ghosts were returning. That afternoon, Agent Rebecca Lawson arrived in Chicago from Washington. She carried a reputation for dismantling public corruption networks that powerful people considered untouchable. She spent hours reviewing Daniel's case. Every inconsistency attracted her attention. Missing footage, altered timelines, contradictory testimony. The deeper she looked, the worse everything became. By evening, she requested a private meeting with Emily. They met inside a secure federal office overlooking Lake Michigan. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. When it ended, Agent Lawson closed a thick folder and studied Emily carefully. "You've spent 3 years pursuing this." "Yes." "Why didn't you stop?" Emily looked toward the dark water outside. "Because my brother deserved better than silence." Lawson nodded. She had heard many answers over the years. Most involved anger, some involved revenge. Emily's answer sounded different. It sounded like responsibility. Meanwhile, pressure continued building around Jack Morrison. Reporters began asking new questions. Why had federal investigators reopened a supposedly closed case? Why were former officers suddenly hiring attorneys? Why were sealed records being requested from city archives? Jack responded with confidence during television interviews. "I welcome any investigation," he declared. "The truth supports my actions." The public saw confidence. His closest allies saw something else. They saw strain. The smile arrived a fraction too late. The answers sounded overly rehearsed. The certainty felt forced. Union attorney Richard Barnes noticed it first. After one interview ended, he pulled Jack aside. "Tell me the truth." Jack's expression hardened. "About what? Is there anything they can find?" The question lingered between them. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Jack laughed. Too quickly, too loudly. "Of course not," Barnes nodded. Yet he left the conversation unconvinced. That same night, Emily returned home after another exhausting day. She found a small package waiting outside her apartment door. No sender, no note, only her name written across the front. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she carried it inside. The package contained a single object, an old digital recorder. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Emily immediately contacted Agent Lawson. Federal technicians examined the device within hours. At first, it appeared damaged. Most files seemed corrupted. Then a specialist recovered a hidden recording. The audio quality was poor. Voices faded in and out beneath static. But one sentence emerged clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "If Daniel talks, we're finished." The speaker wasn't identified, yet Agent Lawson recognized something important. The voice sounded remarkably similar to Jack Morrison. Suddenly, the investigation changed. No longer was it merely a review of a suspicious death. Now, federal agents had evidence suggesting a possible conspiracy. As midnight approached, Lawson signed requests for additional warrants. Across Chicago, phones began ringing, and for the first time in 3 years, the people who helped bury Daniel Carter's case started realizing they might not survive what was coming next. The following week transformed Chicago into a city obsessed with unanswered questions. Television panels debated corruption. Newspaper headlines speculated about hidden conspiracies. Social media exploded with theories. Yet beneath the noise, federal investigators continued building their case with quiet determination. Agent Rebecca Lawson preferred evidence over attention. While reporters chased rumors, her team followed documents, bank transfers, phone records, property transactions, internal department communications. Each discovery connected another piece of a puzzle that had remained hidden for years. One name appeared repeatedly: Jack Morrison. Inside police headquarters, tension became impossible to ignore. Officers whispered in hallways, supervisors held closed-door meetings. Long-time friendships suddenly felt fragile. Nobody knew who might be cooperating. Nobody knew what investigators already possessed. Fear spread faster than facts. Jack tried maintaining control. Publicly, he projected confidence. Privately, cracks continued forming. He slept poorly. He checked news updates constantly. Every unfamiliar vehicle near his home attracted suspicion. Every unknown number calling his phone felt dangerous. The pressure intensified when federal agents executed search warrants at several locations connected to former officers. The searches generated no immediate arrests, but the message was clear. The investigation was expanding. Meanwhile, Emily Carter faced a different challenge. Her growing visibility attracted criticism from powerful people who wanted the story buried. Anonymous articles questioned her motives. Political opponents accused her of exploiting family tragedy. Commentators suggested she sought personal revenge rather than justice. The attacks hurt, more than she admitted publicly. One evening, after a particularly brutal television segment, Emily sat alone in her apartment, staring at muted news coverage. Daniel's photograph rested on a nearby shelf. For several minutes, she simply looked at it. "I hope this is worth it," she whispered. The room remained silent, but the memory of her brother's smile steadied her. The next morning brought a breakthrough nobody expected. A former police sergeant named Thomas Green requested a meeting with federal investigators. Green had retired 2 years earlier. Until that day, he had never spoken publicly about Daniel Carter's death. Agent Lawson met him inside a secure federal office. The interview lasted nearly 6 hours. When it ended, Lawson immediately requested emergency authorization for additional investigative resources. Green's testimony changed everything. According to his account, Daniel had not been considered a threat during detention. In fact, several officers questioned why he remained under unusually strict supervision. Green also revealed that certain reports were altered after Daniel's death. Not by junior officers, by senior personnel, people with influence, people with something to hide. When Lawson reviewed the transcript that night, one passage demanded her attention. Green claimed he personally overheard an argument between Jack Morrison and another officer hours before Daniel died. The exact words were forgotten. The anger was not. Across town, Jack received troubling news from union attorney Richard Barnes. Thomas Green met with federal agents. Jack froze. "How do you know?" "Because half the department is talking about it." For several seconds, Jack said nothing. Thomas Green had always been careful, reliable, predictable. If he was cooperating, the situation had become serious. Very serious. That night, Jack drove alone through Chicago's South Side. Rain reflected across empty streets. Old neighborhoods passed by in silence. He eventually parked beside an abandoned warehouse near the river. Years earlier, the location had served as a meeting point for people who preferred privacy. Now it stood empty. Forgotten. Jack remained there nearly an hour, thinking, remembering. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he had spent years avoiding. What if Daniel Carter's death could no longer be contained? What if the evidence kept growing? What if people started talking? Back in Washington, federal analysts completed forensic restoration of additional files recovered from the anonymous recorder. Most recordings contained nothing useful. One did. The recovered audio featured 2 male voices discussing Daniel Carter shortly before his death. One speaker remained unidentified. The other matched Jack Morrison's voice with 96% certainty. The final sentence stunned investigators. "Make sure he never leaves this building with those records." The timestamp placed the conversation less than 2 hours before Daniel died. Agent Lawson listened twice, then a third time. Finally, she closed the file and looked toward her team. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to, because everyone in the room understood the same thing. The investigation was no longer approaching Jack Morrison. It was closing in on him. By the beginning of autumn, Chicago felt different. The city had not changed physically. The same trains rattled above crowded streets. The same winds swept across Lake Michigan. The same skyline dominated the horizon, but something beneath the surface had shifted. People were paying attention. Questions once dismissed as conspiracy theories now appeared on front pages. National networks dedicated entire segments to Daniel Carter's case. Federal investigators moved openly through city offices. Politicians who once avoided the issue suddenly demanded transparency. For Emily Carter, the growing attention brought both relief and exhaustion. Every day began before sunrise: interviews, meetings, legal briefings, community events, congressional responsibilities. By nightfall, she often felt completely drained, yet she refused to slow down. 3 years earlier, Daniel had lost his voice. Now she carried it for him. Meanwhile, Agent Rebecca Lawson's task force continued assembling evidence at an astonishing pace. Financial investigators uncovered a pattern of unexplained deposits linked to several officers. Communication analysts reconstructed deleted messages. Witnesses who had remained silent for years suddenly requested legal protection. The investigation expanded far beyond a single death. What began as questions surrounding Daniel Carter now exposed signs of systemic corruption. And at the center of everything stood Jack Morrison. Inside his suburban home, Jack watched developments with growing frustration. The world he trusted was changing. People who once defended him publicly now sounded cautious. Some avoided his calls, others hired attorneys. Several former allies agreed to interviews with federal agents. Each new headline felt like another betrayal. One evening, Jack sat alone in his kitchen, reading reports spread across the table. His wife, Karen, entered quietly. She studied him for a moment. "You haven't slept in days." Jack rubbed his eyes. "I'm fine." She didn't believe him, neither did he. Karen had spent years standing beside him through difficult assignments and public controversies, yet even she sensed something different now. Fear, not anger, not frustration. Fear. "Jack," she said softly, "is there anything I should know?" The question lingered between them. For a brief moment, he considered telling the truth. Not everything, just enough. Enough to explain why federal agents kept appearing. Enough to explain why reporters camped outside their neighborhood. Enough to explain why he woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. Instead, he shook his head. "No." Karen nodded slowly, but doubt remained in her eyes. The following morning brought another major development. Agent Lawson received authorization to present preliminary findings before a federal grand jury. The decision marked a turning point. Grand juries existed for one purpose: potential criminal charges. Word spread rapidly through legal circles. Within hours, reporters learned that witnesses had been summoned. Television helicopters hovered above federal buildings. Speculation exploded. Nobody knew exactly what evidence prosecutors possessed, but everyone understood the significance. The government believed a crime had occurred. A serious one. Emily learned about the grand jury while attending a community forum on police accountability. Supporters celebrated the news. She did not. Experience had taught her caution. Investigations could fail. Witnesses could disappear. Evidence could be challenged. Justice remained uncertain until a verdict existed. That evening, she visited Daniel's grave. The cemetery stood quiet beneath grey skies. Leaves drifted across damp grass. Emily placed fresh flowers beside the headstone. For several minutes she said nothing. Then she spoke softly. "We're getting closer." The wind moved through nearby trees. A memory surfaced. Daniel laughing during a family road trip. Daniel teaching neighborhood children to play basketball. Daniel promising that one day he would make a difference. Tears filled her eyes. Not from grief alone, from determination. Elsewhere, inside a secure federal facility, prosecutors reviewed newly recovered evidence from an encrypted storage device obtained during a recent search. Most files involved financial records. One file contained video. The footage lasted less than 3 minutes. Its quality was poor. Its significance was enormous. The recording appeared to show a private meeting between Jack Morrison and two individuals already connected to the corruption investigation. More importantly, the timestamp placed the meeting just days before Daniel Carter's death. As prosecutors watched the video, the room fell silent. One of the men handed Jack a thick envelope. Jack accepted it. Then he said a sentence that changed everything. "Daniel has become a problem. I'll handle it." When the video ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, the lead prosecutor closed the file. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. For the first time since Daniel Carter died, federal authorities believed they could prove intent. And once intent entered the picture, Jack Morrison's future became far darker than he could possibly imagine. The federal grand jury convened on a cold Monday morning beneath heavy gray skies. Reporters crowded the courthouse entrance before sunrise. Television crews positioned cameras along barricades. Rumors spread through legal circles faster than confirmed facts. Inside the building, prosecutors began presenting evidence collected over months of investigation. Witness testimony, financial records, recovered audio, video evidence, communication logs. Every piece pointed toward the same conclusion. Daniel Carter's death had not been an isolated tragedy. It had been part of something much larger. Emily Carter spent the morning in Washington attending committee meetings. Although she maintained a calm public appearance, concentration felt impossible. Her phone remained silent on the conference table. Each vibration from incoming messages made her heart race. For 3 years she had waited for accountability. Now it felt close enough to touch. Across Chicago, Jack Morrison faced a very different reality. His attorney, Richard Barnes, arrived at his house shortly after dawn, carrying several folders. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. When Barnes left, neighbors noticed Jack standing alone in his driveway staring into space. The attorney's warning was simple. Federal prosecutors possessed more evidence than expected, much more. For the first time since the investigation began, Barnes openly discussed the possibility of criminal charges. Jack refused to believe it. He had survived controversies before. Internal reviews, civil lawsuits, political attacks, media scrutiny. Each challenge eventually faded. This would too. At least that was what he told himself. But confidence became harder to maintain as the day progressed. Shortly after noon, federal agents arrested former Sergeant Thomas Briggs, a retired officer connected to several suspicious financial transactions. Briggs immediately agreed to cooperate. The news reached Jack within minutes. His stomach tightened. Thomas Briggs knew things, important things, dangerous things. People only cooperated when they believed they could save themselves. By late afternoon, another former officer entered negotiations with prosecutors, then another. The wall of silence protecting the network began collapsing. One crack at a time. Meanwhile, Agent Rebecca Lawson reviewed fresh testimony from Briggs. Several statements confirmed information investigators already suspected. One statement shocked even experienced prosecutors. According to Briggs, Daniel Carter had collected evidence exposing a criminal operation involving bribery, protection payments, and falsified reports. Daniel planned to deliver the information to federal authorities. Someone discovered his intentions. Within days, he was dead. The timeline fit perfectly. So did the motive. That evening, Emily received an unexpected visitor. Karen Morrison, Jack's wife. The meeting occurred privately inside a small coffee shop near the river. Karen looked exhausted, older than her years. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "I don't know what my husband did." Emily listened quietly. "But I know he's hiding something." The words carried genuine pain. Karen described months of strange behavior, secret phone calls, late-night meetings, growing paranoia, unexplained anger. The man she married seemed to be disappearing. "If Daniel was murdered," Karen said softly, "I'm sorry." Emily felt a complicated mixture of emotions, sympathy, sadness, anger. Karen had not caused Daniel's death, yet she was becoming another casualty of the truth. When the meeting ended, both women walked away carrying different burdens. Neither realized how quickly events were about to accelerate. The following morning, the federal grand jury returned sealed indictments. Dozens of pages, multiple defendants, serious charges. Prosecutors immediately coordinated arrest operations. Before dawn, federal agents deployed across several locations throughout Illinois. One team drove directly toward Jack Morrison's home. At 5:43 a.m., loud knocks echoed through the house. Jack woke instantly. He already knew the moment had arrived. Karen stood frozen in the hallway. Federal agents announced themselves from outside. Additional vehicles surrounded the property. Blue and red lights reflected across rain-soaked pavement. Jack remained motionless for several seconds. Years of confidence, years of influence, years of control, all gone. When he finally opened the front door, Agent Rebecca Lawson stood waiting. Her expression remained professional, calm, unemotional. She handed him a document. "Jack Morrison, you are under arrest on federal charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and murder." The words echoed through the silent morning. Neighbors watched from windows. News helicopters appeared overhead. Karen covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Jack looked at the warrant, then at the agents, then at the cameras already gathering beyond police tape. For the first time in 3 years, he realized something unavoidable. The investigation was over. The trial was about to begin. The arrest of Jack Morrison dominated national headlines within hours. News helicopters followed federal convoys. Television anchors interrupted scheduled programming. Social media platforms flooded with reactions, arguments, celebrations, and disbelief. For years, Jack had been presented as a symbol of law and order. Now his photograph appeared beside words like murder, conspiracy, corruption, and federal indictment. The fall was spectacular. Yet for Emily Carter, the arrest brought surprisingly little satisfaction. She watched the coverage from her congressional office in Washington. Staff members celebrated, supporters sent congratulatory messages, activists called it a historic victory. Emily remained quiet. An arrest was not justice. A trial still lay ahead. Truth still needed to survive a courtroom. Meanwhile, Jack sat alone inside a federal detention center outside Chicago. The cell was small, cold, silent. No reporters, no supporters, no television cameras praising his service. Only concrete walls and the weight of reality. For the first time in years, nobody treated him as powerful. That realization hurt more than handcuffs. His attorneys immediately began preparing a defense. They argued that federal prosecutors relied heavily on cooperating witnesses seeking reduced sentences. They challenged audio recordings. They questioned timelines. They attacked the credibility of evidence recovered years after Daniel Carter's death. The strategy was predictable. Complicate everything. Create doubt. Survive long enough to weaken public attention. But prosecutors possessed something stronger than speculation. They possessed momentum. Every week produced new witnesses. Every witness produced new information. And every new fact made the defense position more difficult. Agent Rebecca Lawson spent most of her days interviewing former associates connected to the corruption network. One witness stood out: former officer Samuel Pierce. Pierce had remained silent for years out of fear. Now he wanted protection. His testimony lasted nearly 11 hours. When investigators compared his statements against existing evidence, the details matched with remarkable consistency. Pierce described secret meetings, protection arrangements, falsified reports. Most importantly, he described Daniel Carter's final week alive. According to Pierce, Daniel had become increasingly determined to expose wrongdoing. He believed evidence could force accountability. He trusted the truth would protect him. He was wrong. That testimony deeply affected Emily. Hearing Daniel's final actions transformed old grief into something else: pride. Her brother had been afraid, yet he moved forward anyway, not because he expected victory, because he believed it was the right thing to do. The realization strengthened her resolve. Several days later, prosecutors revealed another major development. Forensic specialists successfully restored deleted text messages from devices seized during the investigation. Many messages were routine, some were suspicious. One conversation became particularly important. The exchange occurred less than 24 hours before Daniel's death. The sender was linked directly to Jack Morrison. The message contained only 7 words: "Handle the Carter situation before morning." The recipient never responded, but prosecutors didn't need a response. The timing alone was devastating. As trial preparations intensified, public opinion continued shifting. Polls showed growing support for police reform. Citizens demanded transparency. Former officers appeared on television discussing cultural problems inside certain departments. A conversation once considered politically risky became unavoidable. Jack watched all of it from detention. Each headline felt like another door closing. Each interview felt like another betrayal. Yet despite everything, he still believed he could win. Not because the evidence favored him, because he could not imagine losing. That mindset had guided him throughout his career. It had also created many of his problems. One evening, his lead attorney arrived carrying new discovery materials from prosecutors. Boxes filled with documents, audio recordings, financial analyses, witness statements. The attorney placed them on the table. Then he spoke carefully. "Jack, we need to discuss a plea agreement." The reaction was immediate. Jack stood so quickly, his chair nearly overturned. "Absolutely not. You need to listen." "No." The attorney remained calm. "The evidence is becoming overwhelming." Jack stared at him with disbelief. For years, people had followed his orders. Now even his own lawyer sounded uncertain. The conversation ended badly. But after the attorney left, Jack sat alone reviewing a witness list submitted by prosecutors. Names filled several pages: former colleagues, investigators, experts, financial analysts. And one final name near the bottom: Emily Carter. Jack stared at it for a long time, because deep down he understood something terrifying. The trial was no longer about defending his reputation, it was about defending his freedom. And for the first time since Daniel Carter died, he wasn't sure freedom was still possible. Winter arrived early in Chicago. Snow drifted across courthouse steps, icy winds swept between skyscrapers. News crews wrapped themselves in heavy coats while waiting outside the federal building, where one of the most anticipated trials in recent memory was about to begin. Inside, every seat was filled. Journalists, legal analysts, community leaders, former officers, families affected by police misconduct. Everyone understood the significance of the moment. The case had grown beyond Daniel Carter. It had become a test of whether powerful people could truly be held accountable. Jack Morrison entered the courtroom wearing a dark suit instead of a police uniform. The difference was striking. For years, the badge had projected authority. Without it, he looked smaller, older, more vulnerable, yet traces of arrogance remained. He still believed he could control the narrative. Across the room, Emily Carter sat quietly beside prosecutors. She carried herself with the same calm dignity that had frustrated opponents for years. No dramatic gestures, no public anger, only focus. The trial began with opening statements. Lead prosecutor Angela Brooks approached the jury first. Her voice remained measured and deliberate. "This case is about abuse of power," she said. "The evidence will show that Daniel Carter died because he threatened to expose corruption. The defendant believed he was above accountability. He was wrong." The courtroom remained silent. Every juror listened carefully. When the defense responded, they painted a very different picture. They described Jack as a decorated officer targeted by political enemies. They argued that memories fade, evidence deteriorates, and witnesses change their stories. They urged jurors to ignore emotion, focus only on proof. It was a reasonable strategy. Unfortunately for the defense, the proof continued growing. Over the next 2 weeks, witness after witness took the stand. Financial experts explained suspicious money transfers. Forensic analysts authenticated recovered recordings. Federal investigators outlined the timeline of the corruption network. Former officers described a culture of intimidation. Each testimony added another brick to an increasingly solid wall. Then came Samuel Pierce. His appearance transformed the trial. For nearly 6 hours he answered questions. His voice occasionally trembled. His memories remained remarkably clear. He described fear, pressure, silence. Most importantly, he described conversations involving Daniel Carter. When prosecutors asked why he finally came forward, Pierce looked directly toward the jury. "Because a man died," he said, "and because I got tired of pretending I didn't know why." The statement lingered long after he left the stand. Jack watched everything unfold with growing frustration. Several times, his attorneys advised restraint, Several times he ignored them. Notes passed between defense lawyers became increasingly urgent. Control your reactions. Stop shaking your head. Do not speak. Jack followed the instructions briefly, then broke them again. His anger remained stronger than his discipline. Meanwhile, Emily prepared for her own testimony. The prospect unsettled her more than she expected. She had spoken before Congress, addressed national audiences, debated senior officials. Yet discussing Daniel in public still felt painful. The night before taking the stand, she visited the lakefront alone. Snow covered the shoreline, dark waves rolled beneath a moonless sky. She thought about the years that had passed, the funerals, the investigations, the threats, the endless waiting. For a moment she wondered how different life might have been if Daniel had simply remained silent. The answer arrived quickly. He would not have remained silent. That wasn't who he was. The next morning, Emily entered the witness box. The courtroom became completely still. Millions watched through television broadcasts and online streams. Prosecutors guided her carefully through Daniel's life, his dreams, his character, his determination to expose wrongdoing. The testimony was powerful because it was simple, honest, human. When cross-examination began, defense attorneys attempted to portray her as emotionally biased. Emily remained calm. They questioned her motives. She answered directly. They suggested personal revenge influenced her actions. She rejected the claim. They implied she benefited politically from the investigation. She calmly reminded jurors that pursuing the case had generated years of attacks and scrutiny. Nothing about the process had been easy. By the end of the day, even some defense observers admitted she had performed exceptionally well. As court adjourned, jurors filed out quietly. Jack remained seated. His expression had changed. For the first time since the trial began, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Because tomorrow prosecutors planned to introduce their most damaging evidence yet. Evidence that even his attorneys had struggled to explain. Evidence recorded in Jack Morrison's own voice. The following morning, the federal courthouse stood beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Reporters arrived before dawn, despite freezing temperatures. They sensed the trial had reached a turning point. Inside the courtroom, tension hung in the air like an approaching storm. Jurors appeared more serious than usual. Attorneys reviewed notes with unusual intensity. Even spectators spoke in hushed voices. Everyone understood the significance of what was about to happen. Prosecutors intended to play the recording. The recording Jack Morrison feared most. When proceedings began, lead prosecutor Angela Brooks rose from her table. "Your Honor," she said, "the government would like to introduce Exhibit 117 into evidence." Defense attorneys immediately objected. Arguments followed. Technical foundations were reviewed. Forensic authentication was discussed. Eventually, the judge ruled. The recording would be admitted. A silence settled across the courtroom. Angela Brooks pressed a button. Static filled the speakers. A few seconds passed. Then voices emerged. The quality wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Jurors listened carefully. The first voice belonged to an unidentified individual. The second voice belonged unmistakably to Jack Morrison. Federal analysts had already confirmed the match. The conversation began casually. Then the subject shifted to Daniel Carter. The courtroom grew still. Several jurors leaned forward. Then came the sentence prosecutors had referenced repeatedly throughout the trial. "If Daniel talks, everything falls apart." More static followed, then another statement. "Make sure he never leaves with those records." The recording ended. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the defense table seemed frozen. Jack stared straight ahead. His jaw tightened. His attorneys exchanged worried looks. The evidence wasn't a complete confession, but it established intent, knowledge, motive, and prosecutors weren't finished. Over the next several hours, they connected the recording to financial evidence, witness testimony, recovered messages, and documented timelines. Individually, each piece carried weight. Together, they became overwhelming. Defense attorneys fought aggressively. They questioned authenticity. They challenged interpretations. They highlighted inconsistencies. Yet the strategy produced diminishing returns. Jurors had spent weeks absorbing evidence. The broader picture had become impossible to ignore. Late that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Jack Morrison requested permission to testify. The request shocked everyone. His attorneys strongly opposed the decision. Several legal analysts later described the moment as catastrophic. Experienced defense lawyers rarely allow clients to testify when emotions run high. Jack insisted. The judge approved the request. When Jack entered the witness box, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. For a brief period, he appeared composed. He spoke about his career, his service, his sacrifices. He described years spent protecting communities, years spent confronting violence, years spent making difficult decisions. Some jurors listened sympathetically. Then cross-examination began. Angela Brooks approached slowly. She asked simple questions, precise questions, questions requiring direct answers. Initially, Jack responded carefully. Then frustration appeared. Brooks presented financial records. He grew defensive. She introduced witness statements. His voice became sharper. She replayed portions of the recording. His composure cracked. The prosecutor remained calm. "Lieutenant Morrison, why were you discussing Daniel Carter if his detention was routine?" Jack hesitated. The pause felt enormous. "I don't remember the context." "You don't remember discussing a detainee who died hours later?" Another pause, longer this time. Brooks displayed photographs recovered during the investigation, images connected to meetings, payments, associates. The walls began closing in. Jurors watched every reaction, every hesitation, every shift in tone. Then came the question, the one that changed everything. "Lieutenant Morrison," Brooks said quietly, "were you afraid Daniel Carter would expose your operation?" The courtroom froze. For several seconds, Jack said nothing. His attorneys looked horrified. The judge watched closely. Jurors waited. Something inside Jack seemed to snap. Years of pressure, months of investigation, weeks of testimony. Everything collided at once. His face reddened. His voice rose. "You have no idea what people like him were threatening." The prosecutor didn't interrupt. She simply waited. Jack continued. "People sit in offices and judge situations they don't understand. They think everything is simple. They think paperwork and rules solve everything." The room remained silent. Brooks asked one final question. "So Daniel Carter was a threat?" Jack opened his mouth, stopped, then spoke words his attorneys would later describe as the moment the case ended. He was going to destroy everything. The statement echoed across the courtroom. Jurors stared, reporters scribbled furiously, defense lawyers lowered their heads. Because in a single sentence, Jack Morrison had confirmed exactly what prosecutors had spent months trying to prove. Daniel Carter wasn't targeted because of what he had done. He was targeted because of what he knew. And as court adjourned for the evening, everyone inside the courthouse understood the same thing. The verdict had not yet been delivered, but Jack Morrison had already begun convicting himself. 3 days later, the jury returned. Snow still covered Chicago's streets. The sky remained gray and heavy above the federal courthouse. Yet thousands of people gathered outside despite the freezing weather. Some carried photographs of loved ones lost during encounters with law enforcement. Others carried signs demanding accountability. Many simply wanted to witness history. Inside the courtroom, silence ruled. The trial that had consumed the nation for months was approaching its conclusion. Emily Carter sat quietly in the front row. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. Outwardly, she appeared composed. Inside, emotions collided. Hope, fear, exhaustion, grief. 3 years of struggle had led to this moment. Across the room, Jack Morrison looked dramatically different from the man who once dominated every space he entered. The confidence was gone. The swagger had disappeared. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of consequences he could no longer avoid. When the jury entered, every person in the courtroom stood. The foreperson carried a sealed verdict form. No cameras were allowed inside. No microphones captured the moment. Only those present would ever fully understand the tension filling the room. The judge accepted the document. She reviewed it briefly. Then looked toward the defendant. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The words seemed to echo forever. The judge unfolded the paper. A deep silence followed. Then she began reading. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." A collective breath escaped the gallery. "On the charge of conspiracy, guilty." "On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty." On the charge of civil rights violations, guilty. Each word struck with the force of a hammer. Years of power, years of influence, years of intimidation. Gone. Jack closed his eyes. For the first time since his arrest, he offered no protest. No explanation, no excuses, only silence. Emily felt tears forming before she realized it. Not tears of victory. Nothing could restore Daniel. Nothing could return stolen years. Nothing could erase her family's pain. But the truth had finally survived, and that mattered. Several weeks later, sentencing day arrived. The courtroom filled once again. This time the atmosphere felt different. The uncertainty was gone. Only accountability remained. Federal prosecutors detailed the damage caused by Jack's actions. A young man's life lost. Public trust shattered. Communities harmed. Institutions corrupted. When given an opportunity to speak, Jack stood slowly. For a long moment, he stared at the floor. Then he looked toward Emily. The entire room waited. Many expected anger. Others expected denial. Instead, his voice sounded tired. I spent years convincing myself I was protecting something important. He paused. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I only saw obstacles. No one responded. The words were not forgiveness. They were not redemption. But they were the closest thing to honesty he had offered. The judge delivered the final sentence. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The decision ended one chapter. It began another. Over the following year, the Daniel Carter Accountability Act passed Congress with bipartisan support. Independent oversight expanded. Transparency requirements increased. Whistleblower protections strengthened. The reforms were imperfect. Real change always is. But progress had begun. Emily dedicated herself to ensuring the momentum continued. She established scholarships in Daniel's name. She supported families seeking answers. She spoke across the country about accountability, courage, and civic responsibility. Most importantly, she reminded people that justice was never automatic. It required persistence, sacrifice, and ordinary individuals willing to refuse silence. On a quiet spring afternoon, nearly 4 years after Daniel's death, Emily visited his grave. The grass was green again. Birds moved through nearby trees. For the first time in a very long time, peace felt possible. She placed fresh flowers beside the headstone. Then she smiled. "You were right, Daniel," she whispered. "The truth matters." The wind carried softly across the cemetery. Emily stood there for several minutes, reflecting on everything that had happened. One young man chose courage over fear. One family refused to surrender. One corrupt system was forced into the light. The lesson reached far beyond a single city or a single case. Power without accountability becomes dangerous. Silence protects wrongdoing. And ordinary people can change history when they refuse to look away. Daniel Carter's life ended far too soon, but his courage continued creating change long after his death. That became his legacy. And for Emily, that legacy was worth every battle. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.